Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
A quick warning as we begin today's episode of The Big Story contains descriptions of sexual abuse. It's not that surprising anymore when a revered artist is connected to sexual abuse. We have been confronting that for years by now. But there are times, even still, because of who it is, because of just how renowned they are, and because of what they've given us, when it's still shocking to a lot of people, when the secrets are dragged into the light.
In an essay in the Toronto Star, Skinner revealed the sexual abuse she experienced at the age of 9 by her stepfather, Munro's second husband, Gerald Fremlin. She detailed the deep hurt she felt after telling her mother what happened in a letter years later, saying Munro chose to support her husband instead.
Since the MeToo movement began in 2017, the way that we confront allegations or even convictions against beloved artists has been slowly evolving. So too has the way in which we approach victims and even the way in which those victims choose to share their own stories. What does the story of Alice Munro's daughter, Andrea, as well as separate allegations against another incredibly famous author, show us about how far we have and haven't come? Why does the manner in which some victims choose to share their stories seem to matter so much to some people? And what have we learned after 7 long years about the art, the artists, and the dark secrets families can keep, even at the expense of their own children? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Julie S. Lalonde is an educator, an advocate, one of Canada's foremost experts on intimate partner violence, and the author of Resilience Is Futile, The Life and Death of Julie S. Lalonde. Hey, Julie.
Happy to be here.
I wish we were talking about something happier, but as is often the case when you are on this show, it's not.
Yeah, I was like, the patriarchy's been acting up, and so I'm back to have to talk about it. Yeah, it's been a really, really intense week of news, frankly, when it comes to violence against women.
Why don't you start, and I'm sure basically everyone listening has seen at least headlines pertaining to this, but can you explain what we learned this past week about one of Canada's legendary authors, Alice Munro, and her family?
Yeah, I mean, Nobel Prize-winning Alice Munro, who passed away just a few weeks ago, one of her daughters came forward in a piece, a very brave and powerful piece in the Toronto Star, talking about how she had been sexually abused by her stepfather and that Alice Munro knew and chose him over her own daughter, and how she was failed not only by Alice, but also by the broader community that prioritized her mother's fame and her talent over her safety as a young woman.
I'm not asking you for numbers specifically, but just, with your depth of experience, how common is the dynamic that Andrea describes when it comes to abuse in the family by somebody like a stepfather, and then the decisions that are made around that afterwards?
Astoundingly common. Like, this is the norm. And that is horrifying. And I know for people who do not do that work, who do not think about this stuff day in and day out, that probably sounds shocking and untrue, frankly. But I have spent years working with survivors of sexual violence and years trying to talk about it. And for example, it took me over 2 years of pitching to find a Canadian outlet that would do a story on incest and how it is the last remaining taboo of the Me Too moment. Like, we do not want to talk about sexual violence that happens within the family, but it is the most common form of sexual violence. And unfortunately, the norm is that it is either outright ignored, dismissed, or that it's brushed aside. So, okay, this happened, it was awful, but let's move on. That is overwhelmingly the response that families give. And that is horrifying but we can't address that if we don't sit with that reality to begin with.
I want to talk a little bit more about Alice Munro and Andrea's brave piece and what happens when victims do share their stories. But I also wanted to ask you about allegations against another, if not Nobel Prize winning, then certainly legendary author, Neil Gaiman. What's happened there?
I mean, really, truly a moment in time where we're having to really examine people especially from the world of lit, that were revered for different reasons, but still were really seen as masters of their craft. And so Neil has been accused of at least 2 sexual assaults by 2 separate women, one of which was his nanny that he had met just hours prior, and the other was a young fan that he had also just met. And so regardless of whether or not the accusations are proven in court, because he is being charged in New Zealand, the fact that he hasn't denied having a relationship with those women is already a red flag. You know, the man is in his 60s. These were young women in a power dynamic of you're a famous author, this is a fan, you're a famous wealthy author, and this is someone who's been hired to be your nanny. So regardless of what the legal system decides, many people are already just repulsed by the very notion that this was clearly exploitation on his part and an abuse of power in a big, big way.
I saw you make a really interesting point on social media about the reaction to the way that Andrea, as well as the women who were Neil's accusers, shared their stories. One was, obviously, as you mentioned in the Toronto Star, a big Sunday front page newspaper exclusive. And the other accusation came in the form of a 4-part podcast, I guess. And people had things to say about just the method in which they were presented.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see people asking, why is this Toronto Star story that's so important behind a paywall? And why am I only able to find out about what Neil's being accused of through a podcast that launched and is sort of shilling their merchandise and subscribe and join our Patreon and that sort of thing? So this idea that this is breaking news that is in the public interest and therefore should be free and readily available, and that there's somehow a tinge of exploitation, a tinge of sensationalizing by the fact that it was, behind a paywall on the Toronto Star website, and that you had to listen to a 4-part podcast in order to know what the depth of what Neil was being accused of. That's really interesting to me because it speaks to either a cognitive dissonance of what do we even constitute as breaking news that is in the public interest, but also to me a broader conversation around, well, good media costs money. Good investigative media costs money. And I think there's a lot of naivete on behalf of Canadians on how litigious it is to talk about sexual violence,
right,
and how journalists can't just break a story. They have to really, fact check it, go through lawyers. Those are costly things to do, right? And so you can't separate how litigious people accused of sexual violence are from the reality that, okay, in order to uncover these stories, it's going to cost us as well. And that is, to me, a really fascinating conversation that we should be having around media consumption. What is breaking news? And how do we reconcile the reality that it's not as easy as just standing up and saying, I accuse Neil of sexually assaulting me. He can come after me. Thanks to people like Mandy Gray and her new book, Suing for Silence, we know that even people who've gone to police to report a sexual assault, if that report doesn't result in a conviction, those men sue the women who went to the police to report them and often win, right? Like that is how litigious and difficult these conversations are to have.
And how does the fact that, at least in the perception of some people, there is money involved, whether that's the money you need to pay to access the Toronto Star or the money presumably that's being made off advertising on the podcast, impact how some people view the victims for sharing these stories?
Well, people need to remember that Andrea is not getting a cut of your subscription to the Toronto Star.
Right.
And presumably neither of the women who are coming forward against Neil as well. And so, again, I think it speaks to how there's never a perfect way to tell your story. There's never a satisfactory way for you to share an experience of abuse without it being questioned. And whether it's because you delivered it in, a splashy way on the cover of the Toronto Star, whether it's because you waited until the person had passed away, whether it's because you announced it right away, like whatever format you choose and whatever timeline you choose, somebody somewhere is going to act as though that is suspicious. And that, to me, is the conversation we need to be having right now, which is acknowledging that we've decided there's never a good time. And yet when these stories come forward, we all think, well, why didn't anyone say anything sooner? Why, in the case of Alice Munro, we're now finding out many, many people knew about this. I mean, the man was convicted. Her own biographer knew about the story and didn't include it in her biography. So there's a culture of silence that we can't just point at and say, well, that's horrible. We're part of it. We are part of it whenever we question the motivations, the timeline, or the method that someone uses to disclose their story. We created those conditions.
When you heard the news first, when you read Andrea's piece, obviously because of how revered Alice Munro was, and I guess also because of some of the topics of her stories, and let's be honest, because she's a woman, not a quote-unquote another bad man in media or bad man making art. What was your immediate reaction?
I think for me, I wasn't surprised that a woman was complicit in sexual violence. I was not surprised that a mother chose her husband over her child. Unfortunately, the reality of having doing this work for over 2 decades is that is the common reaction. I would have been more surprised if the reaction had been quite different from both Alice and the adults in Andrea's life. What surprised me was the depth of the complicity from those around her, including other people in Canadian media, that there had been conversation about the story coming to light decades ago and that being squashed. That, to me, was what I found the most surprising, is that I had no clue. I knew nothing. No one I knew who's involved in the world of literature, who's a writer, who thinks about these things, was aware of it. So to me, it was like, oh my God, here we are again with a Canadian icon who we covered up for to protect their identity, to protect their reputation over the complicity or the violence that they were perpetuating. Here we are again, Canada, to me, was the most shocking part.
When we were discussing this in our story meeting yesterday, I said, it would be good to ask Julie about how the conversations we have when victims come forward have changed, since Me Too or in the Me Too era. And then one of our producers just said, listen, we're in the post-Me Too era now. What does that mean?
To me, post-Me Too is how I feel when people talk about post-pandemic. I'm like, both are still real and still here and still happening. And so we're post-Me Too moment in terms of the sort of apex of 2017, 2018, when it was really the focal point of our conversations. But the Me Too movement has continued. And were it not for that, we would not have a 4-Port podcast calling out someone as revered as Neil. We would absolutely not have a Toronto Star cover story about beloved Alice Munro and how she was complicit in sexual violence. So that speaks to the fact that we are absolutely still seeing movement under the surface.
I think their point, though, is that it's more acceptable, or we've now seen a backlash towards the accountability that I think a lot of us assumed was changing forever when Me Too hit.
I understand why people feel that way, but if you were on the ground, you saw that day 1 of Me Too was one thing, and then day 2, we already saw the backlash. The backlash was swift, immediate. Those of us who have public profiles talking about feminism can tell you that the death threats, the threats of violence were immediate, right? This idea that we are ruining men's lives, the misinformation, the disinformation, all of that was happening so quickly. Joe Rogan was around, Jordan Peterson was around. These are all people who had big feelings about Me Too and were not being quiet about them. And so I think, to me, the fact that Alice Munro is being dragged to the extent that she is proof that Me Too has made a difference, because she did not commit sexual violence. She was complicit. And yet we are treating her the same way as we are abusers. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I am saying that is remarkable. And I think in a few years, we could look back and think, well, was it because she was a woman that it was easier for us to be angry at her complicity than if she were a man who had covered it up? I do think that's an important conversation to have. But the fact that Alice Munro is being absolutely torn to shreds over the past week speaks to the fact that Me Too has made an impact. Because, again, she did not commit violence. She was complicit, and it's not okay, and there's no excuse for it. But we're talking about her as though she was a Bill Cosby, a Harvey Weinstein. And I think that tells me that we're now starting to understand that rape culture, quote unquote, is not just bad dudes committing violence. It's a culture of complicity.
I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on how a victim's experience coming forward then has evolved since the early days of Me Too, at least based on, what you're seeing in the reaction to Munro and other victims who have come forward recently.
Survivors are now very acutely aware of the litigious nature of telling these stories. I think there was a lot of naivete in the early days of Me Too that you could just go on social media and call somebody out and that it wouldn't have repercussions. And unfortunately, those people realized very quickly that there were. So I think about, the bad men in media list, right? And how she was successfully sued, right? And is going to spend the rest of her life paying out as a result of losing a libel case for calling a man out, right? So I think now we're at a point where survivors are more aware of the limitations on what you can and cannot say if you don't want to get sued. And as a result, I think we are seeing stronger investigative journalism to really address these issues in a way where you can tell the story without risking litigation. But I do think it has created a chilling effect where there are many, many people who saw that, hey, all she did was tweet out an Excel spreadsheet with some names, and now she's going to be indebted to these men for the rest of her life. Whoa, maybe I don't want to do that. We saw a cultural groundswell of people against Jean Ghomeshi, and he got acquitted. And so you're seeing people thinking, well, what is the point? But I do think that overall, survivors are now better informed on the realities and the limitations in this country. And as a result, I think we're seeing stories that are coming out where people are better equipped to be able to tell that story. And another element too, I think that might seem negative to outsiders, but from an inside baseball's perspective is I think quite profound, is survivors realizing that they don't have to share their stories. And I think there was a tremendous amount of pressure in the early days of Me Too to disclose. And this sense that if you didn't add to the hashtag, then your story never happened, it wasn't real, or it wasn't that big of a deal. It sort of proved that you really were traumatized. You had to come forward publicly. And a lot of people did not want to do that, were not comfortable doing that, but also didn't want to be erased. And so I think we've managed to sort of reach a bit more of a balance now in the few years since that sort of apex in 2017, where people are realizing, hey, my story is valid whether I tell two people or the entire internet. And so I get to choose how to share my story and with whom. And I think that's really powerful and healthier moving forward than just, all right, everybody, it's time for you to just flay out your trauma for all of us all to examine.
Right.
In order to be seen as a valid survivor of trauma.
The last aspect I want to ask you about is another evolution, I guess. It's the evolution of how we reconcile the art and the artist. I mean, this is a question I could have asked you probably any month of the last 6 years because we haven't gone long without one of these occurring. But especially with Alice Munro, whose work often focuses on like dark secrets and small towns and that kind of stuff. How has Andrea's story made you rethink her work, and how will we grapple with it?
I think the can you separate the art from the artist question is the question of the 21st century. And I think it's up to everyone to self-reflect. Personally, I was never a massive Alice Munro fan, but I did love her work. And so it certainly taints how I read her stories. And certainly, as you said, the fact, some of the stories that have themes around secrecy and around women's allegiances and proximity to power and all of these sorts of pieces, like you certainly got to look at them in a different light for sure. I respect people who say she is no longer on my bookshelf, can't do it, won't do it. But I also understand people who think that, her work still belongs to us as the readers. And I think of similarly around J.K. Rowling. Again, J.K. Rowling is not someone who committed violence, in a material sense, but she's absolutely calling for violence against trans people. And there are many people who grew up reading Harry Potter and who felt very torn about it. And there are people who've landed on Harry Potter belongs to us as the fans. And the material doesn't change in my view. And it's still nostalgic and important to me and profound. I respect where everyone is coming from that. And I think it's up to people to wrestle with, do my values match up with my actions? And if I claim to be such an ally to survivors, am I going to read American Gods? Am I going to watch the American Gods TV show, right? In the case of Neil, am I going to enjoy an Alice Munro short story, or is there always going to be an asterisk? And for me, that's how I think of it, is I have to put an asterisk beside it for me moving forward forever. That does not mean I don't think her work should be taught, but I think it needs to be taught in context. Like I would say about any other artist who has been found to have committed violence or been complicit in violence, like the context of who we are and our art, you can't separate them from our sort of broader understanding of the end product.
Everyone does have to make their own decision on where they land on that spectrum. But lastly, I will ask you about the Canadian literary circles in general, and specifically the elite ones. I think, as you mentioned earlier, it kind of seemed like some people may have known about this before Andrea came forward. How do you think what Alice Munro did or didn't do will be reckoned with in those circles? And here, I'm talking about the Margaret Atwoods of the world, right? Where this is a very small and insular group in Canada.
It is. I think the same country that has yet to really wrestle with the fact that, dozens and dozens of very revered Canadian authors signed an open letter in defense of someone accused of sexual violence. We haven't yet actually dealt with that and what that says about CanLit. And so I'm not holding my breath that those same people are going to have an in-depth conversation about Alice Munro.
Right.
And in this case, because Alice Munro has died, I think that's also going to embolden people to maybe be a bit more sort of bold in their declarations about her versus, an author who is still alive, who is still actively suing sexual assault survivors in Canada, who they were friends with. And it's easier for them to say, oh my God, what Alice Munro did was horrific. People knew. This is a man who was convicted. Like, this is what's so important to understand. And even the fact that so many media outlets use the word allegation in talking about Andrea's story, it's not an allegation. It's a fact. Proven. He was convicted. He wrote letters where he admitted it, and he was convicted, right? So it's like, there's no he said, she said in this context.
Right.
And I'm not holding my breath for CanLit to actually have a come to Jesus moment right now. And that makes me really, really sad. But I think there is absolutely some pressure that I think those of us who are big readers need to put on them to say, what are you doing? Do better. And is this about you protecting your own skeletons in your closet? Is this about, she was a Nobel Prize winner and that therefore makes all of us look good as Canadian writers? Like, why were we so unwilling to hold this woman accountable while she was alive? And that is a question that CanLit needs to wrestle with. But so far, I am not hopeful.
I guess we'll see in the coming months and years. Julie, as always, thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much for having me. I promise I'll come back one day to talk about something positive.
Julie Lalonde, author of Resilience Is Futile. That was The Big Story. For more, including previous interviews with Julie, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can, of course, always send us feedback on this episode or any other by writing an email to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us and leaving a voicemail at 416-935-5935. The Big Story is available wherever you get your podcasts, and it's on your smart speaker if you ask it to play The Big Story Podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.